The moon hung full and bright over Julesburg, Colorado, casting long shadows across the dusty Main Street as Gwendolyn Kane walked barefoot through the night, her nightgown billowing in the gentle breeze, her eyes open yet unseeing. It was the third time this week she had risen from her bed in slumber, drawn by some invisible force toward the steep cliff that bordered the western edge of town. Frederick Dawson jerked awake at his post on the porch of the small cabin, his hand reflexively reaching for the worn leather holster at his side. Squinting into the darkness, he spotted her pale figure moving through the silver-washed landscape. With practiced ease, he rose from his chair, grabbed the lantern hanging by the door, and set off after her, careful to maintain his distance. He didn't need to wake her, he just needed to keep her safe. The year was 1879, and the small town of Julesburg was finally finding its footing after decades of struggle. The railroad had brought prosperity, but it had also brought Gwendolyn Kane, a young woman with troubles that went far beyond anything Frederick had encountered in his 30 years on the frontier. "Miss Kane," he whispered to himself as he followed her steadily progressing form, "where are you heading tonight?" The cliff edge loomed ahead, a black void against the star-studded sky. Frederick quickened his pace, his boots crunching softly on the rocky ground. Though he'd been watching over her for nearly 3 months now, the fear never lessened when she approached that deadly precipice. Gwendolyn moved with the grace of a sleepwalker, navigating the uneven terrain with uncanny precision despite her closed consciousness. Her auburn hair caught the moonlight, creating a halo around her slender form. At 24, she carried herself with the dignity of someone who had endured far more than most twice her age. She was 10 paces from the cliff's edge when Frederick finally closed the distance between them. With gentle hands, he placed himself in her path, a human barrier between her and the 100-foot drop to the jagged rocks below. "Easy now, Miss Kane," he murmured, though he knew from experience she couldn't hear him. Carefully, he placed his hands on her shoulders and began to slowly guide her in a wide arc, turning her back toward town. This was their strange dance, performed beneath the vast Colorado sky nearly every night since Gwendolyn had arrived in Julesburg. Frederick had first discovered her midnight wanderings by chance, when he was returning late from a card game at the saloon. Now, he made it his duty to watch over her, to ensure she didn't meet a tragic end while trapped in the mysterious prison of her sleep. As they walked back toward town, Frederick couldn't help but wonder what demons drove this beautiful woman from her bed and toward certain death. During daylight hours, Miss Kane was the picture of propriety and competence, teaching the town's children with patience and kindness. Few would suspect the danger she faced each night. When they reached the small schoolhouse where Gwendolyn lived in the attached quarters, Frederick carefully guided her up the steps, and through the door she always left unlocked. With practiced care, he helped her back to her bed, where she lay down without resistance, her breathing deep and steady. For a moment, he allowed himself to look at her peaceful face, memorizing the gentle curve of her cheek and the faint dusting of freckles across her nose. Then, with a sigh, he retreated to his post on her porch, where he would remain until dawn broke over the eastern plains. The schoolhouse bell rang sharply at 8 o'clock the next morning, and Frederick, who had returned to his own cabin just long enough to change his clothes and splash water on his face, watched from across the street as the town's children filed into the building. Through the large windows, he could see Gwendolyn at her desk, her hair neatly pinned and her dress a modest blue calico that complemented her fair skin. She had no memory of her nighttime wanderings or of the cowboy who kept vigilant watch over her. Frederick preferred it that way. A man with his past had no business forming attachments, especially to a refined lady like Gwendolyn Kane. Admiring the schoolmarm again, Dawson. The voice belonged to Henry Miller, the town's barber and one of Frederick's few friends in Julesburg. Frederick straightened, adjusting his worn hat. Just making sure the children aren't giving her too much trouble. Henry chuckled, stroking his thick mustache. Sure you are, just like you've been just checking every day since she arrived. You know, you could simply introduce yourself like a normal person. We've met, Frederick said curtly. It wasn't entirely a lie. They had exchanged pleasantries on the occasions they passed each other on the street, and once he had tipped his hat to her when she thanked him for helping unload supplies for the school. But she had no idea of the nights he spent guarding her safety. Well, she's having dinner at Mrs. Patterson's boarding house tonight, Henry mentioned casually. I hear they are short a gentleman to round out the table. Mrs. Patterson was just saying how she wished she could find someone respectable to join them. Frederick shot his friend a warning look. I'm not one for social gatherings. Suit yourself, Henry shrugged. But even a hardened cowboy like yourself needs more than whiskey and solitude for company. As his friend walked away, Frederick's gaze returned to the schoolhouse window. Inside, Gwendolyn was helping a young girl with her letters, her face animated with encouragement. Something tightened in his chest, a feeling he'd long ago resigned himself to never experiencing again. That evening, Frederick found himself standing on Mrs. Patterson's porch, his hat in his hands and his boots freshly cleaned. He'd even borrowed Henry's straight razor to ensure his face was presentable. Before he could reconsider his decision, the door swung open, revealing Mrs. Patterson's plump, cheerful face. Mr. Dawson. What a pleasant surprise. Are you here for dinner? Frederick cleared his throat uncomfortably. I heard you might be in need of another guest. Mrs. Patterson's eyes twinkled knowingly. Indeed we are. Please come in. The boarding house parlor was warm and well appointed, with a fire crackling in the hearth despite the mild spring evening. 5 people were already seated in the sitting area, including Gwendolyn Kane, who looked up with polite curiosity as Frederick entered. Miss Kane, I believe you've met Mr. Dawson, Mrs. Patterson said, guiding Frederick forward. Gwendolyn smiled, and Frederick was struck by how different she looked in the warm lamplight compared to the ethereal figure he followed through the moonlit landscape. Of course. Good evening, Mr. Dawson. I didn't know you were acquainted with Mrs. Patterson. Mr. Dawson keeps to himself, Mrs. Patterson interjected, but even the most solitary souls need good company now and then. Dinner was a surprisingly pleasant affair. The food was excellent roast beef, mashed potatoes, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert, and the conversation flowed easily among the guests. Frederick found himself speaking more than he had in months, drawn out by Gwendolyn's intelligent questions and genuine interest. So you were a ranch foreman before coming to Julesburg? She asked, her green eyes bright with curiosity. Frederick nodded, careful not to reveal too much of his past. For about 10 years down near Denver. Before that, I drove cattle up from Texas. It must have been exciting, she said. I've only ever lived in cities until now. Philadelphia, then Denver, and now here. What brought you to Julesburg? He asked, though he already knew the answer from town gossip. After her parents' death from influenza, she had taken the teaching position to start fresh. A shadow passed over her face. A desire for change. The city held too many memories. Frederick understood all too well the need to escape one's past. Julesburg is certainly different from Philadelphia. Her laugh was like music. Indeed it is, though I've grown quite fond of it. The people here have been very welcoming. The children adore you, he said before he could stop himself. When she looked at him questioningly, he quickly added, So I've heard from the parents. As the evening drew to a close, Frederick found himself reluctant to leave. In the few hours they had spent together, he had discovered that Gwendolyn was not only beautiful but witty and kind-hearted. She spoke passionately about education, believing that every child, regardless of background or circumstances, deserved the opportunity to learn. When the guests began to depart, Frederick offered to walk Gwendolyn back to her quarters at the schoolhouse. The night was clear, with a full moon rising over the eastern plains. "It's a beautiful evening," Gwendolyn remarked as they strolled down the quiet street. "Though I confess I seldom notice the night sky. I'm usually asleep quite early." Frederick tensed slightly. "You need your rest with all those children to teach," she sighed. "Yes, though lately I've been waking feeling as though I haven't slept at all. Perhaps it's just the adjustment to life here." They reached the schoolhouse all too quickly. Gwendolyn paused at the steps, turning to face Frederick. "Thank you for walking me home, Mr. Dawson. It was a pleasure getting to know you better." "The pleasure was mine, Miss Kane." Frederick tipped his hat. Perhaps we might enjoy each other's company again sometime." Her smile was warm in the moonlight. "I'd like that very much." As Frederick watched her enter the schoolhouse, he felt a conflict brewing within him. The connection he felt to Gwendolyn Kane was undeniable. But how could he possibly pursue it while keeping his nightly vigils a secret? And what would she think if she ever discovered the truth that while she slept, her body tried to fling itself off a cliff, and that he had been watching over her without her knowledge or consent? These thoughts troubled him as he settled onto the porch of his cabin, positioned with a clear view of the schoolhouse. Hours passed, and Frederick began to hope that perhaps tonight would be different. Perhaps tonight she would sleep peacefully. But just as the town clock struck midnight, the schoolhouse door opened and Gwendolyn emerged, her nightgown ghostly in the darkness. With a heavy heart, Frederick rose and began his familiar duty. The pattern continued for weeks. By day, Frederick found increasingly frequent reasons to cross paths with Gwendolyn, helping repair the schoolhouse roof, delivering firewood, even volunteering to speak to her students about ranching life. Their friendship blossomed, and with it, Frederick's feelings deepened. By night, he maintained his vigilance, following her silent form away from town and guiding her back from danger. Some nights were worse than others. During a new moon, she had nearly reached the cliff edge before he could catch her. On particularly bad nights, she would struggle against his gentle restraint, as though some force was pulling her toward the precipice. Through it all, Frederick kept his secret. He told himself it was to protect her dignity, to spare her the fear and embarrassment of knowing her condition. But deep down, he knew he was also protecting himself, afraid that the truth would end the connection they were forming. As spring turned to summer, the people of Julesburg began to notice the growing attachment between the rugged cowboy and the refined schoolteacher. Mrs. Patterson wasn't the only one who made sure to invite them both to social gatherings, and Reverend Thomas had taken to smiling meaningfully whenever they sat near each other in church on Sundays. One warm June evening, Frederick invited Gwendolyn for a picnic by the creek that ran east of town, safely away from the treacherous cliff. They sat beneath the shade of a cottonwood tree, enjoying cold chicken, fresh bread, and the sweet peach preserves Gwendolyn had made. "You miss it?" she asked, watching as Frederick skipped a stone across the creek's surface. "The open range, I mean." He considered her question carefully. "Sometimes, there's a freedom to it that's hard to explain, but it's a lonely life." "Is that why you settled in Julesburg, to be less lonely?" Frederick chuckled. "I wasn't doing a very good job of it until recently. Mr. Miller says I was turning into a hermit. And now," her voice was soft, her eyes searching his face, "now I find myself seeking company more often. Certain company, anyway." blush spread across her cheeks and she looked down at her hands. "I'm glad. I've come to value your company greatly, Mr. Dawson." "Frederick," he corrected gently. "I think we know each other well enough now." "Frederick," she repeated, smiling. "Then you must call me Gwendolyn." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, listening to the babbling creek and the rustle of leaves above them. Frederick found himself studying her profile, the delicate curve of her jaw, and the way the sunlight filtered through the trees to create patterns on her skin. "Frederick," she said suddenly, a strange tension in her voice, "may I ask you something personal?" "Of course." She took a deep breath. "I've noticed. That is, it seems. Do you sleep poorly?" The question caught him off guard. "Why do you ask? You often look tired." "There are shadows under your eyes, and sometimes during the day I've seen you struggling to stay awake." She looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry if I'm being forward. I only mention it because I've been having troubles of my own with sleep." Frederick's heart began to pound. "What kind of troubles?" Gwendolyn's fingers twisted in the fabric of her skirt. "It's probably nothing, just strange dreams. But sometimes I wake up and my feet are sore as though I've been walking. And occasionally there are leaves or dirt in my bed." She looked up at him, vulnerability written across her face. "Do you think I might be walking in my sleep?" The moment of truth had arrived sooner than Frederick had expected, and he found himself woefully unprepared. He couldn't bring himself to lie to her outright, but neither could he reveal the full extent of her condition and his involvement. "It's possible," he said carefully. "Sleepwalking isn't uncommon. My sister used to do it when we were children." Hope brightened her expression. "Really? Did she ever? Did she ever go far?" "Sometimes. We would find her in the barn or the garden." This, at least, wasn't a lie. His sister's sleepwalking had been what first taught him how to guide someone safely back to bed without waking them. "Were you ever afraid for her?" Gwendolyn asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Frederick met her gaze directly. "Yes, which is why someone always made sure she was safe." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding just shy of confession. Gwendolyn's eyes widened slightly, and Frederick could almost see the questions forming in her mind. Before she could voice them, a distant rumble of thunder interrupted the moment. Looking up, Frederick saw dark clouds gathering on the horizon. "We should head back," he said, rising quickly to pack up their picnic. "That storm's moving fast." They made it back to town just as the first heavy raindrops began to fall. Frederick escorted Gwendolyn to the schoolhouse, both of them slightly breathless from their hurried return. At her door, Gwendolyn turned to him, her hair damp from the rain. "Thank you for the lovely afternoon, Frederick, and for listening." He tipped his hat, water streaming from the brim. "It was my pleasure, Gwendolyn." As he turned to leave, she called after him, "Frederick." When he looked back, she was framed in the doorway, her expression troubled. "If someone was watching over me, making sure I was safe, I would be grateful. I wouldn't be upset." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with meaning. Frederick nodded once, then turned and walked away into the downpour, his thoughts as turbulent as the storm. That night, the rain continued to fall in sheets, flooding the normally dry creek beds and turning the streets of Julesburg into muddy rivers. Frederick sat on his porch, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders, his eyes fixed on the schoolhouse despite the deluge. Lightning flashed, illuminating the town in stark white light, followed by crashes of thunder that shook the windows. Surely, he thought, she wouldn't sleepwalk in such conditions. Surely tonight he could rest. But as midnight approached, a bolt of lightning revealed a pale figure moving through the rain, heading west out of town. Frederick cursed, throwing aside the blanket and grabbing his slicker. The storm had reached its peak, making it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead as he pursued Gwendolyn's receding form. The rain-slick ground made the journey toward the cliff even more treacherous than usual. Twice, Frederick nearly lost his footing on the muddy path. Ahead, Gwendolyn moved with the same eerie sureness she always displayed, seemingly unaffected by the storm raging around her. As they neared the cliff edge, panic seized Frederick's heart. In these conditions, with poor visibility and treacherous footing, one misstep could send her over the edge before he could reach her. He abandoned caution and broke into a run, calling her name. "Gwendolyn, stop." Whether it was the unusual volume of his voice or the desperation in his tone, something reached through the veil of her sleep. Gwendolyn paused, swaying slightly. Just yards from the cliff's edge, Frederick reached her side, grabbing her arms more roughly than he intended in his fear. "Gwendolyn, wake up." Her eyes fluttered open, confusion giving way to shock as she took in her surroundings: the storm, the cliff, and Frederick's terrified face. "What? Where am I?" she gasped, her voice barely audible over the storm. "Frederick." Before he could answer, the ground beneath Gwendolyn's feet gave way, softened by the relentless rain. She screamed as she began to slide toward the cliff edge, her nightgown tangling around her legs. Frederick lunged forward, catching her wrist with one hand while grabbing onto an exposed tree root with the other. Pain shot through his shoulder as her weight pulled against his grip, but he held fast, his fingers digging into the wet earth. "Hold on," he shouted, fighting to pull her back from the brink. The rain continued to pour down, making it nearly impossible to find purchase on the muddy ground. With a strength born of desperation, Frederick managed to drag Gwendolyn away from the edge, pulling her up beside him onto more stable ground. They collapsed together, gasping for breath, the reality of how close they had come to disaster sinking in. "You saved me," Gwendolyn whispered, her body trembling against his. "How did you know where I was?" There was no avoiding the truth now. "I've been watching over you," Frederick admitted. "For months, ever since I first saw you sleepwalking toward the cliff." Rather than anger or accusation, relief washed over her face. "It was you, all those nights when I felt protected but couldn't remember why." She reached up to touch his face, her fingers gentle against his rain-soaked skin. "You've been my guardian." The intimate gesture, combined with the adrenaline still coursing through his veins, broke something open inside Frederick. Without thinking, he leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was brief but filled with months of unspoken emotion. When they separated, Gwendolyn's eyes were wide with surprise but not rejection. Before either could speak, another crack of lightning reminded them of their precarious position. "We need to get you somewhere safe and dry," Frederick said, helping her to her feet. "Can you walk?" She nodded, though she kept a firm grip on his arm as they began the treacherous journey back to town. The rain had lessened somewhat, but the ground was still dangerously slick, and they moved slowly, supporting each other with every step. By the time they reached Frederick's cabin, the closest shelter, they were both exhausted and chilled to the bone. Frederick quickly built up the fire while Gwendolyn wrapped herself in a dry blanket, her wet nightgown clinging to her slender frame. "I'll turn my back while you change," he said, handing her one of his clean shirts and a pair of drawers with a drawstring that might stay up on her smaller frame. "They'll be too big, but at least they're dry." While she changed, Frederick kept his promise, staring resolutely at the wall while he explained the situation they found themselves in. "It wouldn't be proper for you to return to the schoolhouse tonight, not in this storm and not in your condition. You can take my bed and I'll sleep by the fire." Once she was dressed in his oversized clothing, Gwendolyn sat by the fire, her wet hair hanging in loose waves down her back. "Frederick, we need to talk about what's happening to me." He nodded, taking a seat across from her. "How much do you remember?" "Almost nothing," she admitted. just fragments of dreams walking under the stars, feeling drawn to something in the distance. She looked up at him, her green eyes reflecting the firelight. How long has this been happening? Since about a week after you arrived in Julesburg. I was coming home late one night and saw you walking barefoot out of town. I followed to make sure you were safe, and when I realized you were sleepwalking. He paused, remembering his horror when he'd first seen her approach the cliff edge. I couldn't just leave you. So every night. Not every night. Maybe 3 or 4 times a week. I keep watch from my porch, and when I see you start walking, I follow. Usually, I can guide you back without waking you. Gwendolyn was quiet for a long moment, processing this revelation. Why didn't you tell me? Frederick sighed, running a hand through his damp hair. At first, I didn't know you well enough. Then, as we became friends, I was afraid you'd be embarrassed or frightened. And then, she prompted softly. And then I was afraid you'd think I was taking advantage of the situation. That my feelings for you were somehow inappropriate because of it. The confession hung in the air between them, more revealing than he had intended. Your feelings, she repeated, her voice barely audible over the crackling fire. Frederick met her gaze directly. Yes. My feelings for you have grown far beyond concern for your safety, Gwendolyn. But I would never, I know, she interrupted, reaching across to take his hand. I know you wouldn't. You've proven your character every night you've watched over me, Frederick. Her touch was warm against his skin, grounding him in a moment that felt almost dreamlike in its intensity. I should have told you, he said. I'm sorry. Gwendolyn squeezed his hand. Perhaps, but I understand why you didn't. She looked thoughtful. What I don't understand is why this is happening to me. Why the cliff? Why every night? Frederick had wondered the same thing countless times. Have you ever sleepwalked before coming to Julesburg? She shook her head. Not that I'm aware of. My parents never mentioned it, nor did any of the girls I shared quarters with at the ladies' seminary. Did anything traumatic happen before you came here? Besides your parents' passing, I mean. A shadow crossed her face and she withdrew her hand. Why do you ask? I've heard that sometimes sleepwalking can be brought on by deep distress or unresolved fear, Frederick explained. My sister's episodes began after she witnessed a serious accident on our farm. Gwendolyn was silent for so long that Frederick thought she might not answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was so low he had to lean forward to hear her over the rain. There was a man in Denver, a doctor who treated my mother during her illness. After she and my father died, he asked me to marry him. Her fingers twisted in the fabric of Frederick's too large shirt. When I refused, he became obsessed. He would follow me, leave gifts at my door, stand outside my window at night. Frederick's hands clenched involuntarily. Did he hurt you? Not physically, but his persistence was frightening. When I received the offer to teach in Julesburg, it seemed like providence, a chance to escape. She looked up, her expression haunted. The night before I left, he confronted me, said if I went through with my plan to leave, I would regret it. That I belonged with him, and that one way or another he would have me. The pieces began to fall into place in Frederick's mind. And the cliff. Do you think your sleepwalking might be related to feeling pursued, like you're trying to escape even in your sleep? Perhaps, Gwendolyn said thoughtfully, or perhaps it's simpler than that. The cliff represents a final escape, one that would ensure he could never have me. She shivered. It's a terrible thought. Frederick moved to sit beside her, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Whatever the cause, you're safe now. I won't let anything happen to you. She leaned against him, her head resting against his shoulder. What if it never stops, Frederick? What if I spend the rest of my life wandering toward that cliff in my sleep? Then I'll spend the rest of mine making sure you stay safe, he replied without hesitation. But I don't think it will come to that. Now that we know what might be causing it, perhaps we can find a way to help you heal." They sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the storm gradually subsiding outside. Frederick was acutely aware of Gwendolyn's warmth against him, of the trust she had placed in him, despite the unusual circumstances of their relationship. "You should try to get some sleep," he said eventually. "It's nearly dawn and you're safe here." Gwendolyn looked up at him, her expression open and vulnerable. "Will you stay near, just in case?" "I'll be right here by the fire," he promised. "I won't let you wander." As Gwendolyn slept in his bed, Frederick kept his vigil by the fireplace, turning over everything she had revealed. The thought of someone threatening her, frightening her so deeply that her mind sought escape even in sleep, filled him with a protective rage he hadn't felt in years. But beneath the anger was a deeper emotion, a tenderness he had long thought himself incapable of feeling again. The kiss they had shared in the rain played through his mind, along with the way she had looked at him afterward, not with shock or disapproval, but with something that looked remarkably like hope. As dawn broke over Julesburg, bathing the cabin in soft golden light, Frederick made a decision. Whatever it took, he would help Gwendolyn overcome the fear that drove her toward the cliff. And maybe, just maybe, in helping her find peace, he might find some of his own. The next few weeks brought significant changes to both Gwendolyn and Frederick's lives. Word had inevitably spread through Julesburg that the schoolteacher had spent a night at the Cowboy's cabin during the storm. While most townspeople were understanding given the circumstances, Reverend Thomas had gently suggested that, for the sake of propriety, they should either formalize their relationship or maintain a more appropriate distance in public. Rather than pull away, Frederick had surprised everyone, including himself, by calling on Gwendolyn officially, bringing flowers to the schoolhouse and escorting her to church socials and community gatherings. Their courtship, unusual as its beginnings had been, quickly became the talk of the town. More importantly, they had begun to address Gwendolyn's sleepwalking with deliberate purpose. Frederick had built a small cabin closer to the schoolhouse, where he could better keep watch over her without causing gossip. Each night, he would sit on the porch until he was certain she was either sleeping peacefully, or until he had safely returned her to her bed. On Reverend Thomas's recommendation, Gwendolyn had also begun writing down her thoughts before bed, recording her fears and anxieties in a leather-bound journal. The practice seemed to help, as the frequency of her sleepwalking episodes gradually decreased. "It's been 3 nights now," Frederick remarked one evening as they walked together after dinner at the hotel restaurant. 3 nights without any wandering." Gwendolyn smiled, her arm linked through his. "I know. I've been waking feeling truly rested for the first time in months." She looked up at him, her expression warm in the fading light. "Though I almost miss seeing you at my door in the morning, checking to make sure I'm all right." "I still check," he admitted. "I just try not to wake you if all seems well." She squeezed his arm affectionately. "My faithful guardian." They had reached the small garden behind the schoolhouse, where summer flowers bloomed in neat beds. Frederick guided Gwendolyn to a bench beneath an apple tree, its branches heavy with small green fruit. "I've been thinking," he said once they were seated, his hand still holding hers. "About the future." Gwendolyn's expression grew serious. "Oh, this arrangement we have, it works for now, but it's not sustainable forever. People talk, and while I don't care much about gossip, I do care about your reputation." He took a deep breath. "And more than that, I care about you." "I care about you too, Frederick," she said softly. "The thing is, Gwendolyn, I've spent most of my life alone. After what happened with my family in Texas, I didn't think I deserved anything more than solitude." He hadn't told her the full story yet about the ranch raid that had claimed his parents and sister while he was away, and the years he'd spent hunting down the men responsible. That was a conversation for another time. But then you came along, walking in your sleep toward that damned cliff, and suddenly I had a purpose again. He turned to face her fully, taking both her hands in his. What I'm trying to say, rather poorly, is that I love you. I think I have since the first night I followed you under the stars, though I didn't recognize it then for what it was. Tears welled in Gwendolyn's eyes, but her smile was radiant. I love you too, Frederick. Even before I knew what you were doing for me, I felt drawn to you. And now, knowing the depths of your care and protection. Frederick reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Then perhaps you'll consider making our arrangement more permanent. He opened the box to reveal a simple gold band set with a small diamond. Gwendolyn Kane, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? For a moment, she simply stared at the ring, her eyes wide. Then, with a small cry, she threw her arms around his neck. Yes, yes, Frederick, I will marry you. As he slipped the ring onto her finger, Frederick felt a peace settle over him that he hadn't experienced in decades. For so long, he had been defined by loss and vengeance, by the ghosts of his past. Now, with Gwendolyn's hand in his, he could finally see a future worth building. The townspeople of Julesburg received news of their engagement with enthusiastic approval. Mrs. Patterson immediately volunteered to host an engagement dinner, while Reverend Thomas offered the church for the wedding, suggesting a date in early September when the weather would still be fair. Amid the flurry of congratulations and well wishes, Frederick noticed a change in Gwendolyn as well. There was a new lightness to her demeanor, as though a burden had been lifted from her shoulders. Her sleepwalking episodes became increasingly rare, and when they did occur, they were less frightening. She would often simply wander to her schoolroom and sit at her desk, rather than heading toward the cliff. As the summer progressed, they fell into a comfortable routine. Frederick continued his work breaking horses for local ranchers, while Gwendolyn taught summer lessons for children who needed extra attention. In the evenings, they would often sit on the schoolhouse porch, planning their future together. I was thinking, Gwendolyn said one evening as they watched the sunset, about what we might do after the wedding. Will we stay in the schoolhouse, or— I've been saving for land, Frederick admitted. Nothing too grand, just enough for a small herd and a decent house. There's a nice parcel about 3 miles east of town, with good water access and gentle hills. Her eyes brightened with interest. Far enough for privacy, but close enough that I could still teach. That was my thought. Though if you wanted to give up teaching to focus on our home, that would be your choice. Gwendolyn shook her head firmly. I love teaching, and besides, we might need the income, especially at first. Frederick smiled, admiring her practical nature as much as her passionate dedication to her students. Then that's what we'll do. I've nearly saved enough for the down payment. I have some savings as well, she offered. It's not much, but together with yours. Together, Frederick repeated, liking the sound of the word. That's what matters. As their wedding day approached, however, a shadow fell over their happiness. It began with a letter that arrived for Gwendolyn from Denver, delivered by a traveler passing through town. Frederick was with her when she opened it, and he watched the color drain from her face as she read the short message. What is it? He asked, immediately concerned. Gwendolyn's hand trembled as she passed him the letter. It's from him. Dr. Holloway. He says he's coming to Julesburg. Frederick scanned the brief note, his jaw tightening at the presumptuous, possessive tone. The doctor wrote that he had given her sufficient time to overcome her confusion and was now coming to bring her back to civilization where she belonged. When did this arrive? Frederick demanded, fighting to keep his voice calm. Today, Mr. Jensen brought it from Denver. She looked up at him, fear evident in her eyes. Frederick, he can't take me back. I won't go. He took her hands, steadying them with his own. No one is taking you anywhere, Gwendolyn. You're going to be my wife in less than 3 weeks. This man has no claim on you. You don't know him, she whispered. He doesn't give up easily. Neither do I, Frederick assured her. That night, after seeing Gwendolyn safely to her quarters, he met with Sheriff Wilson to discuss the situation. The sheriff promised to keep an eye out for any strangers arriving in town, particularly anyone matching the doctor's description. For the next week, Frederick redoubled his vigilance. He escorted Gwendolyn everywhere, even waiting outside the schoolhouse during her teaching hours. At night, he kept watch from his cabin, a loaded rifle within reach. The strain began to show on Gwendolyn. Dark circles appeared beneath her eyes, and her sleepwalking returned with a vengeance. Twice in 1 week, Frederick had to guide her away from the cliff, her unconscious mind once again seeking escape from the threat that loomed on the horizon. 10 days before their wedding, a well-dressed man arrived on the afternoon stage from Denver. Frederick, who had taken to meeting each incoming coach, spotted him immediately tall and slender, with a neatly trimmed beard and expensive clothes that set him apart from the usual travelers. The man carried himself with an air of authority that suggested he was accustomed to being obeyed. Before the stranger could even collect his luggage, Frederick approached him. "Dr. Holloway, I presume." The man looked startled, then suspicious. "You have the advantage of me, sir. Frederick Dawson, Miss Kane's fiancé." A flash of anger crossed Holloway's features before he smoothed them into a polite smile. "Ah, I see. There appears to be some misunderstanding. Miss Kane and I have an understanding of our own." "No, sir, you don't," Frederick said flatly. "What you have is an unwelcome obsession with a woman who has made her feelings perfectly clear. She doesn't want to see you or speak with you." Holloway's smile hardened. "I think I'll hear that from Gwendolyn herself. Thank you. Now, if you'll excuse me." As the doctor attempted to step around him, Frederick placed a firm hand on his chest. "That won't be happening. The next stage back to Denver leaves in an hour. I suggest you be on it." "Are you threatening me, Mr. Dawson?" "I'm giving you good advice. Julesburg is a small town, Dr. Holloway. We look after our own." The doctor's eyes narrowed. "Gwendolyn is confused. She isn't thinking clearly. She needs proper care, something a common cowboy can hardly provide." Frederick's patience was wearing thin, but he kept his temper in check. "Gwendolyn is perfectly clear-headed and she's made her choice. Now you can leave willingly or Sheriff Wilson can escort you to the stage. Your decision." For a tense moment, it seemed Holloway might challenge him further. Then, with a cold smile, he inclined his head. "Very well. But this isn't over, Mr. Dawson. Gwendolyn belongs in Denver with me. One way or another, I will convince her of that." "Don't count on it," Frederick replied evenly. He watched as Holloway retrieved his bag from the stagecoach and made his way to the hotel, then immediately went to find Sheriff Wilson. When Frederick told Gwendolyn about Holloway's arrival, she insisted on facing him directly. "He won't stop otherwise," she explained, though her hands shook as she spoke. "I need to tell him myself with witnesses present that I have no interest in his attentions." Though reluctant, Frederick agreed. The confrontation was arranged for the following morning in Reverend Thomas's study, with the Reverend and Sheriff Wilson present as witnesses. Dr. Holloway arrived precisely on time, dressed impeccably, and carrying a bouquet of flowers that seemed wildly out of place given the circumstances. His expression when he saw Gwendolyn was a disturbing mixture of adoration and possessiveness. "My dear Gwendolyn," he began, offering the flowers, "you look well, though perhaps a bit tired. The country air doesn't seem to be agreeing with you as much as I'd hoped." Gwendolyn didn't take the bouquet. "Dr. Holloway, I asked you here to make my position clear once and for all. I am engaged to be married to Mr. Dawson. I have no desire to return to Denver or to continue any association with you." Holloway's smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened. "You're confused, my dear. This infatuation with a common laborer is merely a reaction to your grief. It's quite understandable, but hardly a basis for a lifetime commitment." "My feelings for Frederick have nothing to do with grief or confusion," Gwendolyn replied firmly. "I love him, and I'm going to marry him next week. Your presence here is unwelcome, and I must insist that you leave Julesburg immediately." The doctor looked from Gwendolyn to Frederick, then to the Reverend and Sheriff. His pleasant demeanor slipped, revealing a coldness that sent a chill through the room. "You've been poisoned against me," he said flatly. "These provincial people have filled your head with nonsense. But I'm a patient man, Gwendolyn. I'll wait until you come to your senses." Sheriff Wilson stepped forward. "That sounds remarkably like a threat, Dr. Holloway. Miss Kane has made her wishes clear. I suggest you respect them and return to Denver on this afternoon's stage." "Or what, Sheriff?" Holloway challenged. "Have I broken any laws? Have I done anything but express concern for a young woman I care deeply about?" "No laws yet," the sheriff acknowledged. "But harassment is something I take seriously in my town. Consider this fair warning." With a curt nod, Holloway turned back to Gwendolyn. "Think carefully, my dear. A hasty decision now could lead to a lifetime of regret." With that, he turned and left the study, his back rigid with anger. Frederick immediately went to Gwendolyn's side, taking her trembling hands in his. "Are you all right?" she nodded, though her face was pale. "He won't give up." "I know him, Frederick. He won't stop." "He'll have to," Frederick replied grimly, "because neither will I." Despite Sheriff Wilson's warning, Dr. Holloway did not leave Julesburg. Instead, he took a room at the hotel and began ingratiating himself with the townspeople, presenting himself as a concerned friend of the Kane family who had promised Gwendolyn's parents he would look after her welfare. To most, he appeared charming and educated, a welcome addition to local society. He offered medical advice freely, attended church services, and made generous donations to community causes. Only those closest to Gwendolyn and Frederick understood the menace beneath his polished exterior. As their wedding day drew nearer, Holloway's tactics grew more desperate. He approached Gwendolyn's students and their parents, suggesting that their teacher was unwell and making decisions that endangered her future. He even went so far as to hint to Reverend Thomas that Gwendolyn's mental state made her incapable of consenting to marriage. The night before the wedding, Frederick kept his usual vigil outside the schoolhouse, more concerned than ever about Gwendolyn's safety. His vigilance was rewarded when, shortly after midnight, he spotted a figure approaching the schoolhouse, not Gwendolyn sleepwalking out, but someone attempting to enter. In the moonlight, Frederick easily recognized Holloway's tall, slender form. The doctor moved with purpose, testing the schoolhouse windows before approaching the door with what appeared to be a set of picks. Frederick stepped out of the shadows, his rifle leveled at the intruder. "That's far enough, Holloway." The doctor froze, then slowly turned. "Mr. Dawson. Out for a late-night stroll? You know damn well why I'm here. Step away from the door." Holloway made no move to comply. "She needs help, Dawson. More help than you can provide. Did she tell you about her condition? About how she walks in her sleep, heading for the cliff like some tortured spirit?" The revelation that Holloway knew about Gwendolyn's sleepwalking sent a chill through Frederick. "How do you know about that?" A smug smile crossed the doctor's face. I make it my business to know everything about my patients. I've been watching her for weeks just as you have. The difference is I can actually help her. I have medicines, treatments that could cure her nocturnal wanderings. The only thing triggering her episodes is you, Frederick growled. Before your letter arrived, she hadn't sleepwalked in nearly a month. A temporary improvement, nothing more. The underlying condition remains. Holloway took a step closer, his voice taking on a persuasive tone. Be reasonable, Dawson. Do you want to spend the rest of your life watching over her every night? What kind of life is that for either of you? A life we've chosen together, Frederick replied firmly. Now, for the last time, get away from that door before I have the sheriff arrest you for attempted breaking and entering. For a moment, something dangerous flashed in Holloway's eyes, a glimpse of the obsession that drove him. Then, with calculated casualness, he stepped back. Very well. Enjoy your wedding day, Mr. Dawson, however long your marriage lasts. The implied threat hung in the air as Holloway walked away into the darkness. Frederick remained at his post until dawn, unwilling to leave Gwendolyn unprotected for even a moment. When morning came, Frederick sent word to Sheriff Wilson about the night's events, then went to find Henry Miller. His friend had agreed to stand with him at the wedding, and Frederick needed his support now more than ever. You think he'll try something at the ceremony? Henry asked as he helped Frederick into his new suit, the first he'd owned since leaving Texas. I don't know, Frederick admitted. But I'm not taking any chances. Sheriff Wilson has deputized 2 men to keep watch at the church. Henry straightened Frederick's tie with practiced hands. Don't worry. Between the sheriff, his deputies, and half the men in town who'd step up if needed, Holloway won't get anywhere near Gwendolyn today. The reassurance helped, but Frederick couldn't shake the sense of foreboding that had settled over him. Holloway was a man accustomed to getting what he wanted, and his fixation on Gwendolyn had clearly crossed the line into dangerous obsession. The wedding was scheduled for 2 o'clock that afternoon. By 1:30, the small church was filled with nearly every resident of Julesburg, all dressed in their Sunday best to witness the union of their schoolteacher and the once solitary cowboy who had won her heart. Frederick stood at the altar with Henry beside him, scanning the congregation for any sign of Holloway. The doctor was nowhere to be seen, which only increased Frederick's anxiety. Sheriff Wilson, positioned near the door, gave him a reassuring nod. When the church door opened and Gwendolyn appeared, Frederick momentarily forgot his concerns. She was radiant in a simple white dress, her auburn hair arranged in an elegant knot adorned with small white flowers. Mrs. Patterson accompanied her down the aisle, having gladly accepted the role of surrogate mother for the occasion. As Gwendolyn reached his side and placed her hand in his, Frederick felt a surge of protective love so powerful it nearly took his breath away. Whatever happened, he would keep her safe. He would not let Holloway or anyone else harm her or take her from him. Reverend Thomas began the ceremony, his voice carrying clearly through the packed church. Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today in the sight of God and this company, to join this man and this woman in holy matrimony. The service proceeded without interruption, each word bringing Frederick and Gwendolyn closer to the life they had planned together. When the time came to exchange vows, Frederick spoke with a depth of emotion that surprised even himself, promising not just to love and cherish Gwendolyn, but to protect her always in wakefulness and in sleep. I now pronounce you husband and wife, Reverend Thomas declared at last. What God has joined together, let no man put asunder. You may kiss your bride. As Frederick leaned down to seal their union with a kiss, the church doors burst open with a bang. Every head turned to see Dr. Holloway standing in the doorway, his usually immaculate appearance disheveled, his eyes wild. "I object," he shouted, though that moment in the ceremony had long passed. "This marriage is invalid. The bride is not of sound mind." Sheriff Wilson moved quickly to intercept him, but Holloway pushed past, a small revolver appearing in his hand. Women screamed and men rose from their seats as the doctor advanced down the aisle, the weapon trained on Frederick. "Step away from her," Holloway demanded. "She's coming with me back to Denver where she belongs." Frederick instinctively moved to shield Gwendolyn, keeping his body between her and the gun. "Lower your weapon, Holloway. This is over." "Over," the doctor laughed, a brittle, unhinged sound. "It will never be over. She's mine. I've watched her, studied her, protected her from herself. You think you can keep her safe? You don't even understand what's wrong with her." Gwendolyn stepped out from behind Frederick, her face pale but determined. "There's nothing wrong with me, Edward, and I was never yours. Please, put down the gun before someone gets hurt." "Listen to your wife, Holloway," Sheriff Wilson said, cautiously approaching from the side, his own weapon drawn. "This won't end well for you." For a moment, indecision flickered across Holloway's face. Then his expression hardened. "If I can't have her, no one will." He redirected the gun toward Gwendolyn. Several things happened at once. Frederick lunged toward Holloway as the sheriff shouted a warning. Henry and several other men moved to disarm the doctor. And from the church balcony, where he'd been positioned as a precaution, Deputy Collins fired a single shot. Holloway crumpled to the floor, the bullet striking his shoulder and causing his own shot to go wild, splintering a wooden pew rather than finding its intended target. Within seconds, he was disarmed and restrained, his injury bleeding but not life-threatening. As the sheriff and his deputies removed Holloway from the church, Frederick gathered Gwendolyn into his arms, his heart pounding with residual fear and overwhelming relief. "Are you all right?" he asked, searching her face for signs of shock or distress. To his surprise, she nodded with remarkable composure. "I am. It's truly over now, isn't it?" Frederick glanced toward the church doors, where Holloway's angry shouts could still be heard as he was led away. "Yes, it's over. He'll face charges that will keep him locked away for years." Reverend Thomas cleared his throat, bringing their attention back to the interrupted ceremony. "Well," he said with admirable steadiness, "as I was saying, I now pronounce you husband and wife. Again." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the congregation, breaking the tension. Frederick looked down at Gwendolyn, his wife, and saw in her eyes not fear or trauma, but a steadfast love that had weathered its greatest test. This time, when he kissed her, the church erupted in cheers and applause, the community celebrating not just their union, but their triumph over the darkness that had threatened to engulf them. The wedding reception went ahead as planned, though with much excited discussion of the dramatic events at the ceremony. Frederick and Gwendolyn accepted congratulations and well wishes, finding comfort in the normalcy of the celebration after the harrowing interruption. That night, they stayed at Frederick's cabin, soon to be replaced by the home they would build together on their new land. As Gwendolyn prepared for bed, Frederick found himself watching her with a mixture of love and lingering concern. What if he escapes? Gwendolyn asked suddenly, voicing the fear that had been lurking at the edges of their happiness. "What if he comes back?" Frederick crossed to her, taking her hands in his. "Then I'll be here. I'll always be here, guiding you back from the edge if you need me to." She smiled, reaching up to touch his face. "I know, but I don't think I'll need that kind of guidance anymore. For the first time in months, I feel truly safe. Free." That night, Frederick still woke several times to check on his wife, a habit too deeply ingrained to break immediately. But Gwendolyn slept peacefully beside him, her breathing deep and even, her body still. As dawn broke over the eastern plains, painting the small cabin in golden light. Frederick watched Gwendolyn stir and open her eyes, a smile spreading across her face as she saw him. "Good morning, husband," she murmured, stretching contentedly. "Good morning, wife," he replied, his heart full. "Did you sleep well?" "Better than I have in years," she said, reaching for his hand. "No dreams of cliffs or falling, just peace." Frederick pulled her close, marveling at the journey that had brought them to this moment. From the first night he had followed her sleepwalking form, to the wedding that had nearly ended in tragedy, they had faced dangers both seen and unseen together. Now the future stretched before them bright, hopeful, and mercifully free of midnight wanderings toward precipices. "What shall we do today?" Gwendolyn asked, her head resting against his chest. Frederick smiled, thinking of the land waiting for them, the home they would build, the life they would create together. "Whatever we want. We have all the time in the world," and they did. In the years that followed, Frederick and Gwendolyn Dawson became pillars of the Julesburg community. They built their ranch east of town, raising cattle and horses that became known throughout Colorado for their quality. Gwendolyn continued teaching for several years until the birth of their first child, a son they named James. A daughter, Elizabeth, followed 2 years later, and eventually another son, Matthew. Dr. Holloway was sentenced to 10 years in the territorial prison for his crimes, and while the threat of his eventual release lingered in their thoughts occasionally, it diminished with time. When news reached them years later that he had died of pneumonia while still incarcerated, they received it not with joy, but with a quiet sense of closure. As for Gwendolyn's sleepwalking, it never entirely disappeared, but it changed dramatically. On rare occasions, perhaps once or twice a year, Frederick would wake to find her standing by the window, gazing out at the stars. But she never again walked toward the cliff. Instead, he would gently guide her back to bed, or sometimes simply stand with her, sharing the peaceful moment until she returned to sleep on her own. On their 20th wedding anniversary, they revisited the cliff that had played such a pivotal role in their story. Standing a safe distance from the edge, with their teenage children exploring nearby, Gwendolyn squeezed Frederick's hand. "You ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" she asked. "If you hadn't seen me that first night, if you hadn't stayed awake to guide me back." Frederick looked at his wife, at the silver threads now winding through her auburn hair, at the laugh lines that framed her still bright eyes. He thought about their children, their home, the life they had built together, all because he had happened to be in the right place at the right time. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but mostly I just feel grateful that I was there, that I found you wandering in the moonlight." Gwendolyn smiled, looking out over the vast Colorado landscape that had become their home. "My faithful guardian," she said, echoing words she had spoken so many years ago. "Always guiding me back from the edge." "Always," Frederick promised, drawing her close. And as they stood together, surrounded by the family they had created and the land they had tamed, he knew it was a promise he would never break, not as long as there were stars in the sky and breath in his body. For the cowboy who had once stayed awake each night to guide a sleepwalker back from danger had found something he never expected. Not just a woman to protect, but a love that had awakened his own slumbering heart, guiding him back from the emotional precipice where he had balanced for so long. Together, they had built a life where neither of them had to walk alone in the darkness again.